Nike says its $250 running shoes will make you run much faster. The company believes the shoes are about 4% better than some of its best racing shoes. If a running shoe made you 25% faster, would it be fair to wear it in a race? What about 10%? Or 2%? The Nike Zoom Vaporfly 4%, a bouncy, expensive shoe released to the public 1 year ago, raises these questions like no shoe in recent distance running history. Nike says the shoes are about 4% better than some of its best racing shoes, as measured by how much energy runners spend when running in them. That is an astonishing claim, an efficiency improvement worth almost 6 minutes to a 3-hour marathoner, or about 8 minutes to a 4-hour marathoner. Ad choice advertising and read invented by Teads, and it may be an accurate one, according to a new analysis by the New York Times of race data from about 500,000 marathon and half-marathon running time since 2014. Advertisement using public race reports and shoe records from Strava, a fitness app that calls itself the social network for athletes. The Times found that runners in Vaporflies ran 3% to 4% faster than similar runners wearing other shoes, and more than 1% faster than the next fastest racing shoe. We found that the difference was not explained by faster runners choosing to wear the shoes, by runners choosing to wear them in easier races, or by runners switching to Vaporflies after running more training miles. Instead, the analysis suggests that, in a race between two marathoners of the same ability, a runner wearing Vaporflies would have a real advantage over a competitor not wearing them. The advantages for runners wearing Vaporflies were consistent for slower racers and fast ones, for men and women, for runners on their second marathon or their fifth. The Vaporflies, which retail at $250 a pair, were widely released to the public by Nike last summer. Unlike most running shoes, they have a carbon fiber plate in the midsole, which stores and releases energy with each stride and is meant to act as a kind of slingshot, or catapult, to propel runners forward. Compared with typical training shoes, the Vaporflies are believed to wear out quickly. Some runners have said they lose their effectiveness after 100 miles or so. Advertisement. The apparent effectiveness of the shoes highlights an issue that has vexed sports officials for decades: how to determine which technological advances constitute an unfair competitive advantage. Golf officials barred the use of certain balls that fly straighter, the NFL barred the use of a sticky substance that helped players catch the ball, and swimming officials barred high-tech suits that were said to have enhanced buoyancy and speed. The swimsuits were believed to lower times by as much as 2%, comparable to the apparent advantage derived from Nike Vaporflies relative to the next best performing popular shoes in our data. The International Association of Athletics Federations, TRAC's governing body, has rules about shoes, but they are vague. Shoes must not be constructed so as to give athletes any unfair assistance or advantage. It does not specify what such an advantage might be. The rules also state that shoes must be reasonably available to all in the spirit of the universality of athletics. The Vaporflies sell out quickly. On the secondary market, a pair can cost $400 or more. Nike's newest version of the shoe, the Elite Fly Print, was sold to a limited number of runners in London for the 2018 London Marathon at a cost of £499, about $650. When asked whether the shoes conform to track and field's rules, a spokesman for Nike wrote in an email that the shoe meets all IAAF product requirements and does not require any special inspection or approval. Yannis Nicolau, a spokesman for the IAAF, said that while it's accurate to say that the Vaporflies are legal, it's actually more accurate to say there is no evidence they shouldn't be. Advertisement. We need evidence to say that something is wrong with a shoe, he said. We've never had anyone to bring some evidence to convince us where these estimates come from. An ideal experiment to measure how much shoes matter for race performance might involve a series of marathons on a variety of courses, with runners randomly assigned different running shoes. That experiment does not yet exist, but something like it happens around the world almost every weekend, when tens of thousands of amateur runners compete in races and upload their race data, collected on smartphones or satellite watches, to Strava. This data usually includes statistics like a runner's overall time, splits for every mile, and a map of the runner's route. In about one-third of the races on Strava, athletes reported data on the shoes that they wore. Based on profiles from more than 700 races in dozens of countries since 2014, the New York Times compiled results from about 280,000 marathon and 215,000 half-marathon completed races. These race records are public, but the Times obtained permission from every athlete named in this article. Below, we describe the 4 ways we measure the shoe's effect. Measuring shoe effects using statistical models. Pros of this approach: tries to control for race conditions, weather, gender, age, pre-race training, and a runner's previous race times. Cons of this approach: still not a randomized controlled trial. We know a lot about the runners in our dataset, including their age, gender, race history, and, in some cases, how much training they've done in the months before a race. We also know about the races themselves, including the distribution of runners' times and the weather that day. We can put all of this information into a model to try to estimate the change in runners' time from their previous races. After controlling for all of these variables, our model estimates that the shoes account for an expected improvement of about 4% over a runner's previous time. Including the uncertainty around the estimates, the Vaporflies are a clear outlier, one of the only popular shoes we can really say makes any difference at all. This model estimates the effect of wearing Vaporflies compared with the effect of wearing any other shoes. It estimates the expected change in race time from a runner's previous race given the runner's age, gender, race history, training miles, for those athletes whose training logs are public, and the weather conditions on race day. There are several statistical approaches one could take with this dataset, and we tried several of them. None are perfect, but every way we tried, the effect of the shoes was more or less consistent, whether we included training miles or omitted them, whether weather data was included or ignored, or whether we modeled the change in time after switching shoes or the change in time from a runner's average. Of course, these observations do not constitute a randomized control trial. Runners choose to wear Vaporflies, they are not randomly assigned them. One statistical approach that seeks to address this uses something called propensity scores, which attempt to control for the likelihood that someone wears the shoes in the first place. We tried this, too. Our estimates didn't change. Comparing groups of runners who completed the same 2 races. Pros of this approach: follows athletes of similar ability who ran in identical conditions. Cons of this approach: runners could save their special shoes for when they expect to have a fast race. Tony Haratonov and Marios Athenios don't know each other. In fact, they live on opposite coasts, but they have something in common: they both failed to get the time they wanted in the 2017 Boston Marathon. But they failed together, just 9 seconds apart, 3 hours 2 minutes and 4 seconds and 3 hours 2 minutes and 13 seconds, respectively. That race was one of the hottest in years, with temperatures approaching 80 degrees, and both runners were off-pace after the course's famous Heartbreak Hill, around mile 21, and slowed considerably in the race's final miles. Running a marathon in less than 3 hours is a sign of an elite runner, and Boston is one of the world's most prestigious races. In April, the men returned to run it again, and both switched to a different pair of shoes. Haratonov wore Ultra Solstice shoes, and Athenios wore Vaporflies. Once again, weather was a factor. The 2018 race featured pouring rain, strong winds, low temperatures, and a big rise in dropouts. This time, the results were different. Athenios, 42, a researcher based in San Francisco, finished with 33 seconds to spare, at 2 hours 59 minutes and 26 seconds. But Haratonov, 49, a software engineer in Millburn, New Jersey, could not stay warm, and once again could not maintain his pace. For the fifth year in a row, he failed to break 3 hours at the Boston Marathon, finishing in 3 hours 7 minutes and 17 seconds. Perhaps not surprisingly, given the conditions, neither runner identified shoes as a factor in this year's result. And, given what we know about how different the races were, it may seem unhelpful to compare times between them at all. But there is still meaningful information in events like these in aggregate. Instead of directly comparing performances in the two races, we can compare the net change of runners who switched to Vaporflies with the net change of similar runners who did not. Of the 1,275 runners in our data who ran Boston both years, 52 switched to Vaporflies in 2018, as Atheneos did. On the whole, those runners' times improved more than that of the group of runners who did not. This specific comparison may be too extreme for any study of shoes, and perhaps it is. But Boston 2017 and Boston 2018 are just one pair of races, and there are hundreds of pairs of races in our data in which large groups of runners ran the same two races and in which a subset of them switched shoes. When we compare all these pairs of races among all kinds of popular shoes, we see that, on average, runners who switched to Vaporflies improved their times more than similar runners who switched to any other kind of popular shoe. Following runners as they switch to a new kind of racing shoe. Pros of this approach accounts for runners of varying skills over several races. Cons of this approach: runners could save Vaporflies for when they expect to be faster than normal, or Vaporfly wearers could be different in some way from other kinds of runners. The runners who use Strava are an enthusiastic bunch. About 1 in 4 have uploaded data for 2 or more marathons, and about 1 in 10 have uploaded data for 3 or more. The Strava data allows us to follow these repeat racers over time, and, crucially, as they change shoes. Glenn Casson, 49, a doctoral student at the Southern California University of Health Sciences, is one of these avid runners. He has uploaded 5 marathons to Strava since November 2015, and he wore a different pair of shoes in every race. In January, at the Houston Marathon, he decided to race in Vaporflies. In Houston, Casson improved on his Boston time by about 18 minutes, an improvement owing to much more than a pair of shoes. He attributed his result, at 2 hours 56 minutes and 0 seconds, to many things: perfect weather, a fast course, and the culmination of 2 consecutive years of a training regimen that included, on average, about 50 miles of running per week. But he said he also thought the shoes made a difference. Everything aligned, and then you throw that shoe on top of it, he said. The pace felt so easy that you felt like questioning, what's going on here? When is it not going to feel easy? Casson is a single data point, but in our data there are almost 4,000 runners just like him, men and women who have uploaded results for 5 marathons or more. When we aggregate the change in race times for runners the first time they switched to a new pair of shoes, runners who switched to Vaporflies improved their times more than runners who switched to any other kind of popular shoe. Measuring the likelihood of a personal best. Pros of this approach, a measure of race performance most runners know by heart. Cons of this approach, doesn't account for race conditions, increased training miles, or aging. Runners who switch to Vaporflies could be different from other runners. Race times are, in many ways, a crude way to measure performance. A marathon is not like a 400-meter dash or a 100-meter freestyle swim. One marathon may be hilly or feature sharp turns, others may be flat and straight. Weather, too, is important, with higher temperatures typically resulting in much slower times. And yet race times are how runners qualify for prestigious races, like the Boston Marathon, and most runners know their personal best times by heart, regardless of whether the race they ran was flat or hilly, on a hot day or a cold one. We can follow the runners in our data with this measure in mind, testing whether a runner's fastest time is more likely when he or she switches to the Vaporflies, or any other kind of shoe. Consider 2 fast runners in our data: Stephanie Andre, 35, a freelance writer from Bixby, Oklahoma, and Amanda Hicks, 34, a product director in Washington, D.C. Both women have uploaded several marathons to Strava and both switched to the Vaporflies for a recent marathon. Andre ran the 2017 Chicago Marathon and Hicks the 2018 Boston Marathon. By objective standards, both women had excellent races. Andre placed 22nd among women in Chicago with a 2 hours 41 minutes and 50 seconds, fast enough to qualify for the 2020 U.S. Olympic team trials, and Hicks finished in Boston with a 3 hours 15 minutes and 31 seconds, among the top 5% of all female finishers that day. Andre set her personal record, but Hicks did not. Someone can run a personal best for all kinds of reasons unrelated to shoes. A runner may train more, execute a better strategy on race day, or run an easier course. Regardless, we found that runners who switched to Vaporflies were more likely to run their fastest race than runners who switched to almost any other kind of popular shoe. Putting them all together, none of these approaches are perfect, but they all point to a similar conclusion. Wherever we look for evidence that shoes matter in a marathon or half marathon, we find Vaporflies that are near the top of that list. More than that, the shoes tend to be outliers among all popular shoes, suggesting that there is something happening in races with Vaporflies that is not happening in races with nearly any other kind of popular shoe. Nothing is certain, of course, and we describe some reasons for continued skepticism below. But from our perspective, the most honest answer we can give to the question, do Vaporflies really make runners faster, is a qualified yes. Reasons to remain skeptical: the data is self-reported and self-typed. All of our analysis comes from runners who publicly tell Strava what shoe they're wearing during a race, which they type in manually. The race records included about 33,000 distinct shoe descriptions, and our analysis depends on standardizing those records. Even for a shoe as heavily marketed as the Vaporflies, Strava users found 147 different ways to spell the name. We've done our best to identify misspellings, remove shoe records that are clearly incorrect, and consolidate different variations of the same basic shoe. But there's no perfect way to do so. More problematic is when runners do not identify their shoes with enough precision for us to categorize them. Wherever possible, we've attempted to identify the shoe to its most specific name, differentiating between shoes within a shoe line or franchise. But not all runners were this detailed. This was most common among Adidas shoes. Adidas, for example, lists more than a dozen different sub-franchises belonging to its Boost franchise. When runners did not specify to this level of detail, we simply identified the parent franchise of a given shoe. This could mask high-performing shoes within a franchise. These estimates compare Vaporflies only with other popular shoes. Perhaps the greatest limitation of this dataset is that for us to make meaningful conclusions, it requires that large groups of people run in a pair of shoes. This necessarily omits less popular shoes that, for all we know, may be faster than the shoes mentioned in this article. The analysis includes only the 50 most popular shoes, those with roughly 500 races or more in our data. There still may be something we're missing that's not captured in the data. It's possible that runners wear Vaporflies only when they know they are going to run faster, or that the act of wearing Vaporflies correlates with other things that indicate a runner is going to run faster. We acknowledge that it's impossible to control for every factor that affects marathon performance. But we have some evidence that it really is the shoes. First, we identified training mileage in the months leading up to a race for runners whose training logs are public, an important indication that a runner is getting more serious in his or her race preparations. Training miles are a variable we included in our statistical approach, and when we matched pairs of runners who ran in the same groups of races, we tried to match not just race time but also training regimens, where possible. Second, the effect of the shoe was persistent across different tiers of athletes, for 3-hour marathoners and 4-hour marathoners alike. Faster runners improved their race times at about the same rate that slower runners did. Finally, if runners raced in vaporflies only when they thought they might have their best race, we might expect to see fewer of them on days with suboptimal weather. But we do not see that. In the 2018 Boston Marathon, in particular, a race with conditions few runners would prefer, no shoe was more popular among the runners in our data who reported what they wore. Reasons to believe these estimates. This is a large sample of runners. There's nothing random about people so enthusiastic about running that they upload information about all their races and shoes to a social media site. But we believe the dataset is broadly representative of competitive runners. Among the races known as the World Marathon Majors, the largest and most competitive races in the world, about 1 in 6 finishers uploaded race data to Strava and made it public. Not counting the Tokyo Marathon, about 1 in 5 did. These runners are a little faster than a much larger sample of runners that other researchers have examined, but they are broadly similar. In all, about 600 different athletes reported wearing vaporflies in 825 marathons and half marathons. They were the 32nd most popular shoe in this data. The speed increases associated with vaporflies are consistent with the increases in a Nike-funded study by University of Colorado researchers published in the journal Sports Medicine. That experiment measured the energy output of 18 male elite runners on a treadmill at various speeds and concluded that, on average, runners in vaporflies exerted 4% less energy than they did in other racing shoes. They estimated such a savings would translate into a performance improvement of around 3% for a 3-hour marathoner. Our findings were similar but showed a smaller effect. We found vaporflies to be 1% faster than the next fastest running shoe in our data, the Nike Streak, but our sample included a much wider range of athletes, and included men and women. Runners who improved their performance in vaporflies and then switched to other shoes got slower. There were very few runners in our data who met this criteria. We counted just 24 such races. But these runners finished about 7% slower on average than they did while wearing the vaporflies. Of the 24 races, 17 races were slower, and 7 were faster. By Taboola sponsored links, promoted links. You may like Vikings. Free online game. Play this for 1 minute and see why everyone is addicted. Vikings, free online game. Undo Shapel. Are you afraid of losing your luggage? Don't worry now, Shaplunda Babel. This app will have you speaking a new language in 3 weeks. Babel Unda. Straits Times telling changes in Singapore's banking scene. The Straits Times Unda Top Man Fun. 10 most breathtaking highways of the world. Top Man Fun and Wow fashionable stunning pictures of clothing for parties. A fashionable Undo.